Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this press panel on climate change and human mobility. Displacement linked to extreme weather disasters and the impacts of climate change is one of the most pressing challenges of the 21st century. However, much can be done to minimize displacement, to ensure rights and protections for people on the move, and to support long-term strategies to ensure those who may be forced to move in future are able to do so safely and with dignity. We have a very knowledgeable and experienced panel to explore these issues with us, beginning with a direct account of recent experiences in the Caribbean, then a look at the global picture, and then finally a look at some of the actions and solutions necessary to address these growing challenges. Our panelists will each speak for 2 minutes, and then of course we will have time for some questions. So without delay, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Camilla Minerva, the Humanitarian Program Manager with OXFAM in the Dominican Republic. Camilla.
Thank you, Simon. Well, as you've said, I've been working in the Caribbean in response to this hurricane season, which has become one of the most active hurricane seasons, the strongest in history, with daunting trends in hurricane formation, mentioning only, for example, the case of Hurricane Irma, which holds the records for the most consecutive days as a Category 5 hurricane, or the example of Hurricane Maria, which holds the record for the strongest and fastest intensification of a hurricane, going merely from a tropical depression to a Category 5 hurricane in 24 hours. This, of course, linked with other effects of climate change, like rising sea levels and stronger surges, is translated in a considerable increase in the risk of displacement. During this hurricane season alone, for example, we saw the displacement of 1.7 million people in Cuba. That is the equivalent of 15% of its population. More than 50,000 people in the DR that were permanently displaced from their homes. Or the case of Barbuda, which is now, for the first time in 300 years, completely uninhabited. And what we see is that these effects are disproportionately borne by those that are the most marginalized and poorest. As an OXFAM report that has just been published showed, it is the poorest and most marginalized that are 5 times more likely to be displaced and to remain so for a longer time than people in higher income countries. This is increasing with climate change. And even when planned, what we see is that displacement is traumatic and disruptive. It implies the loss of ancestral lands and seas, as well as the loss of cultural ties and livelihoods. What we see from this moment is that there is an increase, an urgency for stronger and action to reduce and address the causes of climate change, and to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. There is a need to increase the flows of finance for adaptation and disaster risk reductions, which have proven on-the-field actions that work in decreasing the number of displaced people and increasing resilience of these poorest and marginalized communities. So there is an urgent need to finance these activities. And finally, there is the necessity to show action and support to loss and damages initiatives and that address those impacts of climate change to which we cannot adapt. The Caribbean cannot be moved out of hurricane prone areas, neither can the islands of the Pacific. So it is imperative for these islands not only to adapt, but to adequately respond to those effects to which we cannot avoid.
Thank you, Camilla. Thank you, Camilla. Nina Buckland is Senior Advisor, Disaster Displacement and Climate Change with the Norwegian Refugee Council and Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you. After hearing about the current situation in the Caribbean, we wanted to bring a little bit of spotlight, not only on one region, but globally. We have one slide up here. And as you can see from that, since we at NRC and IDMC started monitoring disaster displacement in 2008, on average, 25 million people have been displaced every year. To put that in perspective, if you compare to people displaced by conflict and violence, it has been 2, 3, 4 times as much every year. If you look at this map, you also see that almost every country in the world is affected. You can also see from the color coding, the light blue is weather-related events, and these account for more than 85% of the displacement. The yellow are geophysical. When we look at this, we think it's important to not just look at the global figure, but also go down on the country level. And if you look at the specific figures from 2016, which is the last year we have full figures from, sorry, that one. We know that the countries with a high population have the highest numbers. So globally, the 5 countries that had the most people displaced by disaster and climate displacement were China, with more than 7 million people, Philippines, 6 million, India, 2.5 million, Indonesia, 1.2 million, and the United States, 1.1. We can go further on the list, but to save a bit of time. We also wanted to look not only on numbers total, but also break it down to which are the populations most affected. So if you then look at the figures on the amount, no, sorry, having 2 computers. So if you look at the figures, if we look at the figures on how many people are affected within the population, we see that the 5 countries globally that have the highest proportion of population affected by displacement are all island states. It's Cuba, that we just heard about, and then Fiji, Philippines, Tonga, and Sri Lanka. So again, the focus on states, oceans is very, very important. For us, as NRC and IDMC, we think that 3 things parties need to look at. Need, first of all, to meet the commitments that were made in Paris on reduction in emissions, to really go towards the 1.5 increase. We need to make sure that states prepare for and prevent climate displacement, both through climate change adaptation, but also through disaster risk reduction. And finally, we need to secure that migration with dignity is possible to try to minimize the number of people that have to be displaced. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Next, we have Maureen Frank, who is the Climate Change and Disaster Displacement Program Officer with UNHCR.
Thank you very much, Simon, and good afternoon, everyone. I just want to discuss how COP23 is relevant for addressing this issue, and maybe give you a little bit of background of how this issue has been addressed by the UNFCCC process over the years. In 2010 already, the Cancun Adaptation Framework, paragraph 14F, frames this issue as displacement, migration, planned relocation, and has for increased adaptation measures on this issue. And then in Doha, COP18, we have this issue framed as a loss and damage issue. And recently at COP21, the Paris Agreement both recognized in its preamble the need for increased human rights for migrants, and also provides for the creation of a task force on displacement that is mandated to develop recommendations to avert, minimize, and address displacement by COP24, so by the next COP next year. This COP here in Bonn is very important and a great opportunity to address this issue and implement what's out there already. It's the first time in history that UNFCCC has an island state as a COP presidency, and loss and damage is extremely important for this presidency. There are 3 priorities for the COP where human mobility can be mainstreamed and addressed. First, the facilitative dialogue, which will assess, as from now until 2018, how parties are doing in implementing their commitments to combat climate change. And this dialogue should not only focus on mitigation of greenhouse gases, but also recognize the impacts of climate change on populations, including displacement, and the need to enhance ambition and support to address these impacts. The second priority is, as you know, the implementation of the Paris Agreement, which was adopted 2 years ago, and now parties are discussing the rules of implementation of this agreement, or it's also called the work plan of the Paris Agreement. And for human mobility, it's clear that the focus is on the task force on displacement and how to enable this task force to deliver strong recommendations that will have impact on populations that are at risk of being displaced or already displaced by the effects of climate change. That includes also involving experts that are outside the task force and civil society to ensure these recommendations are strong. And the third priority is action on climate change. That means that there are a lot of implementers on the field, stakeholders that are implementing already priorities of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. UNHCR, for example, works with states, but also the Platform on Disaster Displacement to address protection issues rising from displacement in the context of climate change. For people that do cross the border and are not qualified as refugees. We also have developed guidance on planned relocations since 2014, and this year, together with IOM and other partners, we have launched a toolkit to plan and implement for relocations in climate change contexts. I'll leave you there. And
thank you, Miriam. Miriam Troll is the Migration, Environment and Climate Change Specialist with the International Organization for Migration. Over to you, Miriam.
Thank you very much. So far we've been mostly talking about displacement linked to disaster, but it's also important to remember that the slow onset effects of climate change make people move or migrate, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes in a forced way. In a country like Bangladesh, we did a survey last year, and 40% of the migrant households that we interviewed told us that climate change contributed directly to their decision to migrate. So this tells us that we need to take action right now. So let me just very quickly go back to the third priority of COP23, which is climate action, and give you maybe just a few examples of the kind of programs and projects that we could implement, notably in the Pacific, from IOM perspective. First of all, nothing can be done without the right policy frameworks at the national level. So this means supporting states to ensure that they take into account migration and displacement matters in their national policy. Secondly, there are instances, and we know that very well, where people will just not be able to stay where they are. What do we do in anticipation? As Marin said, we have to plan for relocation of people. There are a number of guidelines, but more needs to be done. And we also need to think of voluntary migration schemes, like labor migration schemes that can benefit both migrants and the communities of destination. And finally, we have examples from other parts of the world where migrant communities and diaspora communities have been involved in the fight against climate change. So this is also something that we need to take into account, and in the hope to respond to the slow onset impacts of climate change on migration. So our message is very simple. We need to take action now. We need to find the financing. We need to develop the programs on the ground.
Thank you, Miriam. And finally, may I introduce Atle Solberg, Head of the Coordination Unit for the Platform on Disaster Displacement.
Thank you, Simon, and good afternoon, everyone. I represent a technical secretariat of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, which is a state-led initiative currently under the leadership of Germany and Bangladesh. And the aim of the platform is to better protect those that are displaced in the context of disasters and adverse effects of climate change. So the platform seeks to find ways to help people stay if they are at risk of displacement by strengthening and scaling up disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation strategies. It seeks to find policy options regarding people shall move safely if they are moving in the context of disaster and climate change, for example, through migration as adaptation or planned relocation, and how to better protect people if displacement is unavoidable. And particularly if displacement is across international borders, the platform promotes options such as humanitarian visa and temporary protection, so people can be better be protected. There are some opportunities, particularly regarding cross-border disaster displacement, to influence migration governance. And there is a process there's an ongoing process to develop a compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. And it's very important that when states start to negotiate next year on this compact, that the impacts of climate change are addressed in these compacts. So it's a very important moment to try to influence migration governance, particularly in situations where climate change plays a big role. And there's also, of course, an ongoing work under the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage and the Task Force on Displacement to also try to influence what can be recommendation in that regard. So on that note, I think I'll end my intervention. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Atle, and thank you all our panel for your very expert and insightful comments on these pressing challenges. I'm now going to hand to Maureen, who will moderate the questions. We have about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. And we will take questions now. Please stand up and introduce yourself and tell us for which media you're working for before saying your question. And please be concise so that we can take as much question as possible. Yes, gentlemen.
Myself, Jayanta Basu from the Telegraph newspaper, India. My question is to the panel that in the face of the huge amount of migration, climate-triggered migration that has been happening, as you've been pointing out, is there been any effort to make the climate refugee a kind of a legalized component? Because unless there is a legality involved with the climate refugees, they will be kind of having huge impact. So that's a very important issue, the whether, because I am from the part of the India where a lot of migration is happening between India and Bangladesh, West Bengal part of India and Bangladesh for this sea level rise, as you pointed out, the slow onset of climate change. So any agenda, any development on this legalizing or this climate refugee?
Thank you. I think we'll take 3 questions and then we'll answer them. So another question.
Georg Ehring, German Radio, Deutschlandfunk. I would like to know how many of these disaster-displaced people go to other countries and how many are displaced internally.
Thank you very much. One more question before we answer? I think we'll just enter these 2 first questions and then we'll take a second row of questions. So on the legalization of climate refugee, I think I'm well placed to try to answer this one. But as you know, the refugee legal status is provided by the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is very clear on what ground you get or not a refugee status, which is basically persecution. And in the context of climate change displacement, there might be cases where there is persecution involved, where this refugee status could apply, but in most cases it doesn't. In most cases, there is no persecution aspect to this displacement. Hence, the refugee protection might not be the right answer. On the other hand, if you look at states' practice, you can see that on the ground they have developed humanitarian visas, for example, or temporary protection and stay arrangement, or they have worked in their national laws, migration laws, to allow people displaced by climate change across border to be protected, to get assistance and protection in another country. So these approaches are still very ad hoc here and there, and now what we work on is really much to harmonize this. And we work on this at the regional level because we find with the Nansen Initiative and the Platform on Disaster Displacement that these dynamics of cross-border movements are very regional. So we work in the Americas, for example, or in Africa to ensure that the existing frameworks in place are more harmonized and predictable in terms of protecting people and providing them with assistance.
I can start on the response on numbers and where do people go, etc. When we look at this from the Norwegian Refugee Council and Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, it's no coincidence that it's our Internal Displacement Monitoring Center that do this work, because almost everyone who are displaced by disasters and effects of climate change, they start their displacement as internally displaced. The information we have today shows that almost all remain in their countries. Some people do cross borders. We don't have any good statistics on this yet, so I don't want to put any figures. But I think what is important to highlight is the lack of rights and protection people have when they cross borders. And I think it might be better that Atle Solberg from PDD follows up on those protection issues.
Okay, maybe to reply with a very concrete example for that gentleman, for what could be a promising practice. Last week, New Zealand introduced the idea that they can have a humanitarian visa category for people that are moving in the context of the adverse effect of climate change. And that is a practice we would welcome, and we find it very interesting that states can use their discretionary matters or discretionary authority on migration matters to decide whether to invoke a humanitarian visa in such situation. We have identified more than 50 countries that have built on such practice. And if we could scale up that to the double, let's say we have got more than 100 countries that are introducing these policies and practices, that will help a lot of people to protect their protection needs if they cross international borders. And maybe on to the second question, we don't really know. What we do know is that the majority of people that are displaced, they are displaced internally. But since the category doesn't exist, not in international law and very often in statistics, we don't really know how many are moving across international borders. But we know that are people moving across international border, but most people are displaced internally.
We have time for one or two more questions. Yes, please.
Be helpful to.
Please introduce yourself if you don't mind.
Georg Ehring, German Radio. Would you think it would be helpful to produce such a category of refugee, environmental refugee?
Well, there are ideas around this issue of broadening the scope of refugee protection. First, it's not necessarily desirable because there's a risk of undermining the refugees fleeing persecution and violence, conflict. If we broaden to a very large category of people, we know people displaced by disasters and climate change are, I think, 3 times more than people displaced by conflict. So that might undermine this category. And also, that we need also renegotiating the convention, and there is no appetite for that from states. And it might also not be the most effective protection tool, because if we look at what exists already at regional level and try to have this bottom-up approach where we broaden at the regional level the effective practices, it's much more effective because states are going to look at what their neighbors are doing and maybe adopt the kind of same procedures, rather than if we adopt a global convention or a new category globally, it might not be easy to negotiate, and it's not also sure that states will then implement it properly, rather than this bottom-up approach, which is more effective.
And if I may add there, I think also we need to be realistic, because this is happening now. As we've seen, sudden onset disasters already, 25 million every year. Slow onset, we don't have figures on, but we know that the day we have those figures, it will be much larger. So I think what is important is to look at how can we assist and help people now, as we discussed, how do we prevent and try to help people not have to move. If they have to move, how can you then have rights, whether you move inside your country or across a border? But what we have seen is that when it happens, many states, many neighboring states step up and try to help. And as Atle Solberg said, how can we learn from each other and have things happen now and not wait for a convention on new category? I'm not saying that we don't need to think in those terms, but we shouldn't just wait for a convention before we do action. We need to do things, and we can do things now, and states are already doing this.
One more question before we close this press briefing. Yes, please. Here.
I'm Kelvin from Malaysia. I understand that UNHCR also has a mandate for a stateless population as well. So coming from where I am, Malaysia, and we have the Bajau Laut and also a huge stateless population that's also under the crisis of being climate refugees in the next 5 to 10 years. I'm just throwing this question to the panel, if there's any existing strategy or strategic measures to especially cover or protect the stateless population that are vulnerable to climate displacement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have actually issued a report a few years ago on protecting people that are stateless as a result of climate change. I think it's from 2009, and we are looking at reviewing this report in the future. And so UNHCR has this mandate on statelessness, but not focused on climate change, of course, but focused on conflict-linked statelessness. And statelessness in the context of climate change is an issue that we need to look closely at in the context of sea level rise also, and the disappearance of low-lying islands country. I thank you everyone for your question, and I hand over to Simon for closing.
Yes, thank you. I believe we're out of time. Thank you again to our panelists and for the questions. There are a number of significant side events coming up over the coming days. One tomorrow involving many of us on called Uprooted by Climate Change, Responding to the Growing Risk of Displacement in Meeting Room 7. And there are a couple of others by some of the other members here, if you want to mention them quickly.
So we have a side event tomorrow at 1:15, room 12, on human mobility issues. The panel will be composed of UN agencies, and every agency will bring its own perspective, so from what their mandate is on. So that will collect recommendations for the task force on displacement. So you are really welcome to come. It's in the Bonn zone.
Thank you. And finally, if you'd like to speak and ask further questions of any of our experts here, then of course do grab them on the way out. And thank you very much.